when we settled on the title for this talk a while ago, not many people could have guessed how appropriate the title would be when the time came to meet here. Nobody could have guessed how dramatically the world has changed in the last few weeks and how far-reaching the implications are for both domestic orders and the international order. The democracy uprising in the Arab world has been quite a spectacular display of courage, dedication, and commitment by popular forces, and it also teaches us a lot about ourselves. It's quite instructive to observe the Western reaction to these uprisings. In part, it's very familiar. What's happening has happened many times in the past. It commonly becomes difficult or impossible to salvage your favorite dictator. And when that happens, there's a familiar plan that goes into effect this time too. First, try to sustain them as long as possible. No good? Yeah.
It's okay.
Okay. Try to sustain them as long as you can. If it becomes impossible, maybe the army turns against them or the business classes turn against them, then what you do is send them away somewhere, and then try to restore as much of the previous order as possible. It happens over and over. Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, Mobutu in the Congo, Suharto in Indonesia, just case after case. It's nothing to be surprised about as to what's happening now. It's just replaying the familiar record. But there are differences. There are different efforts, different kinds of efforts to sustain the dictator. And there are actually two factors that predict quite well how hard the Western powers will work to sustain the dictator. One factor is how much oil they have. The other factor is how obedient they've been. In the case of countries that have a tremendous amount of oil and have been very obedient, then the effort to sustain the dictator is very powerful. In fact, we've just seen it in the past few days. Saudi Arabia is the most obedient and has the most oil, so that's where the most effort goes. There was a planned day of rage, uprising in Saudi Arabia, but the security presence was so overwhelming that people didn't even try. They were too afraid even to appear. Same happened in Kuwait, another rich oil state with a very obedient leadership. And the same is happening in Bahrain. What about Libya? Libya has plenty of oil, but it doesn't meet the condition of obedience. Gaddafi has been pretty independent in many ways since he took power. He's a brutal dictator, all kind of atrocities for years, but he has oil and he's a little independent, and that leads to conflicting policies. So the Western powers have strongly supported him. In fact, the extent of that support has just been illustrated in the last few days. Fortunately, the press has suppressed it all, but in the last couple of days, there's a trial that has been going on in The Hague, a trial of Charles Taylor from Liberia, who he's being tried for massive atrocities in Sierra Leone. And the prosecutors wanted to indict Gaddafi because Gaddafi had been the main funder and trainer of the forces that carried out the atrocities. According to the prosecutors, he's responsible for over 1 million dead. But Britain, the United States, the Netherlands intervened to prevent the prosecutors from prosecuting Gaddafi. The way they put it is the international community meaning the U.S. and anyone who happens to agree with it, that they intervened to protect their friend Gaddafi from the trial. The timing is not so good. It's not nice for that information to come out right when we're supposed to be hating Gaddafi, so therefore it hasn't been reported. But you can find it out. It's just the last few days. And it's one of many examples where this killer and torturer has been strongly supported by the West because he has oil. But also, he's not too obedient, so he's often attacked, sometimes directly attacked. For example, in 1986, the U.S., as you know, I'm sure, bombed Tripoli and Benghazi and other Libyan cities. That was a very remarkable bombing campaign. It also tells us a lot about the media. It was the first and only bombing in history that was planned for primetime television. And I mean it precisely. In the United States at that time, all television channels had their major news programs at 7 p.m. in the evening. And the bombing was carefully timed so that it would be at exactly 7 p.m. Now, that was a pretty tricky operation because the planes had to fly from London to Libya, and France didn't allow them to cross its territory, so they had to go out into the Atlantic Ocean and come by and start the bombing exactly at 7 p.m., which is a difficult logistic operation, but they were able to carry it out. By accident, all the television stations happened to have bureaus in Libya at that time, and we're supposed to believe that that was by accident too. In fact, I had a friend who was a television correspondent for one of the major networks. He called me up at 6:30, half an hour before, and told me to watch television. He couldn't say what was going to happen, but he said, watch the 7 o'clock news. And sure enough, at exactly 7 o'clock, the bombing took place, exciting pictures on television, everything blowing up and so on. And after about 15 minutes of this, it shifted to Washington, where they were standing there, and the government was able to present its version of what happened. Well, that was an unusual bombing. It didn't have any credible pretext, but Libya is an easy kind of punching bag, no support, so you can do anything you like. And that's one of a number of cases. So it's been a kind of a mixed story with Gaddafi. And right now, that's the one country where the West is calling for supporting the rebellion, none of the others. The others, we have to try to protect the dictator and the regime, but if you have to have some words favoring the uprising, have the words, but try not to do anything about it.